We have a very complex political event to cover today, and I want to cover it in 32 minutes. And that is the English Civil War, which is a stupid name because England has a whole bunch of civil wars. For example, the War of the Roses was a civil war. We're going to be talking about the background to the English Civil War, and then we'll be looking at the course of events that results in England not becoming an absolutist state like France, but rather England is going to become a highly centralized parliamentary state. And so I think it's interesting to think about this in relation to Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes likes to talk about how the state should have total power over the members of the state, or the Commonwealth, as he calls it. But he does not necessarily insist that it has to be a single person. It can be an assembly of men. And so what we're going to see with England is that they are going to centralize power, but not under a monarch. Rather, they are going to centralize power absolutely under Parliament. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Yes, on it.
It's not like, is the definition like of it being like entity that like, let's say that has total like control over violence?
Yes. According to Max Weber, and a definition that is still used by a lot of people. Sneha, why don't you just move your computer? So according to Max Weber, in a famous definition of the state, a state is an organization with a monopoly on legitimate violence within a given territory. Also sometimes appended to this definition is that he sometimes also defines a state as a compulsory organization of domination. So compulsory in that you don't get to decide whether or not you're a member of the state. You just are. Yes?
Is this like by Hobbes himself, or is this another dude who bases the ideas off Hobbes?
This is Max Weber, who is another realist social theorist. He writes a lot later. He writes in the early 20th century. But he is in the same tradition as Machiavelli and Hobbes and other kind of realist theorists that understand the state and political relations in terms of power. Right, anyway, so what we're going to see is we're going to see the formation of a powerful English state as a result of these English civil wars, but not under a king. And so let's start with some background. So, go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, shoot. There we go.
So here's our wide boy, one more time, Henry VIII. So a lot of the problems that ultimately result in the English Civil War are going to start with Henry VIII's bold choice to abolish the English connection with Catholicism and to establish the Church of England, which puts the English monarch as the head of the church. Under Henry VIII, royal power is wielded by cooperating with Parliament. Parliament is a two-chambered house that represents the wealthy landed interests of England. Both the wealthy aristocrats who are elected to the House of Lords and the wealthy commoners, or the gentry as they became known, who were elected to the House of Commons. And the House of Commons and the House of Lords worked together to pass spending bills. Basically, they were in charge of actually granting the right to taxation that the king depended on for doing anything. So how it worked is that Henry VIII and all of the monarchs before him actually had far-reaching powers to tax and spend, but they had to get parliamentary approval. The idea here was that the nobles were allowed to consent to taxation. And then they would pay most of those taxes because they were the wealthy people with most of the land. So unlike in France, where nobles were never taxed, in England, nobles and wealthy commoners were taxed, but they also received parliamentary representation and had some say over the form that these taxes would take. And under Henry VIII and his immediate successors, this was a functional system. And it allowed the English king to raise a significant amount of money in times of crisis, to fund military campaigns and navies and stuff like that. Now, one of the big problems that Henry VIII is going to create for future generations is he is going to create widespread religious division. And there's going to be basically a spectrum of religious ideology that catches on in England. So, on the one hand, you're going to have Catholics. And these guys are going to reject every single thing about the reforms, and they're going to demand that England return to the fold of the Catholic Church. Among other people, Mary I, Henry's oldest daughter, is going to demand a full return to the Catholic Church and is even going to marry His Most Catholic Majesty, Philip II of Spain. And for a couple of years, until Mary randomly dies of a fever, Spain rules England under Mary I. Yes?
Doesn't she kill a bunch of Anglicans, which gives her the name?
That's why she is known as...
Yeah.
Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary.
No!
Ah.
Plus, I think you have to say it in the mirror.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why she's...
Bloody Mary, Bloody.
So that's why she's known as Bloody Mary. But that is largely the result of Protestant propaganda and a persistent pro-Protestant bias in Western or in American history. Because Elizabeth I also executes a ton of Catholics, but we don't call her, Bloody Elizabeth. That also doesn't roll off the tongue.
It doesn't have the same ring to it.
Yeah. So on the other hand, you're going to have people in the middle who are Anglican. And these guys are going to vary in how Catholic or how puritanical they are. But so that is basically the spectrum of religious belief in England. Is on the one hand, you're going to have pure Catholics. On the other hand, you're going to have pure Puritans who want to basically make England as close to Calvin's Geneva as possible. They're going to want to eliminate every vestige of the Catholic Church. They're going to want to get rid of bishops. They're going to want to eliminate iconography. They're going to want to eliminate all of the sacraments except for baptism and marriage. And then the monarchs are going to be stuck in the middle. And they're going to be pulled back and forth in both directions by conservative Catholics on the one hand and then radical Puritans on the other hand. And this is going to create endless problems for Henry VIII's progeny. And then for the progeny means his kiddos, who he finally had.
Yay.
Yeah, good for him. Yeah.
Or like the relative percentages of the population of that.
Oh, it depends where you're at. Actually, could we So in England, a pretty solid majority are cool with Anglicanism. There are Puritans on the one hand, and there are some Catholics on the other hand. But in the actual English homeland, most of the people feel a pretty strong loyalty to the English crown and are pretty chill with Anglicanism. Ireland is now a colony of Britain. Some people call Ireland Britain's first colony. And Ireland is staunchly Catholic. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have a bunch of poor Catholic Irish people being ruled over by Anglican landlords, which is going to lead to religious tension that still persists today, and resulted in a bunch of bombings and stuff in the 1970s and 80s in what is known as the Troubles. And Scotland is strongly divided. So Scotlanders divide themselves up into the Highland Scots and the Lowland Scots. Highland Scots tend to be staunchly Catholic. Lowland Scots tend to be Anglican, if not devout Puritans. So there's a strong division within Scotland that's going to result in various tensions during the English Civil War. Yes, ma'am?
Well, Highland, do you mean like the northern part of Scotland?
I'm actually not exactly sure where the Highlands are.
Okay.
It's like the more rural, mountainous bits.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I imagine that's just kind of in the interior, and the Lowland Scots are like, where the cities are.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so, much like many other places, the people living in the rural mountainous regions are a little more traditional and conservative than people living in the well-connected cities. All right, cool. Go back to the slideshow, please, Andrew. So I can't give you exact percentages, but that's kind of a regional breakdown of the divisions.
Wait, where is it?
It's right here.
Oh,
Gracias. Okay, so that's the last time we're going to talk about Henry VIII. Goodbye, Henry. Let's go on to his first kiddo, little Edward VI. So Edward VI was born to Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who was well beloved by everybody and who died in childbirth. Alas. But she did give birth to a son. Edward VI was a sickly child, and he was a hemophiliac, which meant that even a small bruise or cut could result in massive bleeding, and so he had to be taken very good care of. In spite of that, he still died young, and he only managed to rule for 6 years before dying. But Edward VI did oversee some important reforms, even though he was a little champ for the whole time that he was in charge. Yeah?
Wait, when did Henry VIII die?
Henry VIII died in 1547 as a corpulent, immobile mass of a man.
Define corpulent.
Grossly fat.
Okay.
He always had an immense appetite, and he used to be quite a sportsman in his younger days, hunting and riding and jousting and shooting. But he hurt his leg in a jousting accident and stopped exercising, but did not change his eating habits. And he became grossly fat in his old age. Yes?
Did they not ban nobles from participating in jousting and stuff?
Henry VIII loved jousting. He very much imagined himself still as the kind of noble, knightly king, and he would have tournaments in which he would joust against other nobles. And anytime a noble got paired up with Henry VIII, they never knew what to do, because they knew they shouldn't beat him, but they also knew that if they lost on purpose, Henry VIII would hold it against them. So it was kind of a lose-lose situation. But he hurt his leg when he fell off his horse at a jousting competition. So obviously, if you're king and you don't have a good heir lined up, don't joust. Just don't do it. Don't invade Switzerland either. Okay, so this is Edward VI, and he was a little guy, and he had strongly Protestant advisors in charge. So advisors who were kind of more over towards the Puritan side of things. And whereas Henry VIII basically was just Catholicism light, without the Pope, Edward VI allows his advisors to push him towards a more actually Protestant agenda. Yes, on it.
Never mind, actually.
Okay, cool. So among a lot of other things, the most important thing that he does is he has published the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer is made available to all of the churches within the Church of England, and it has prayers and ideas and songs that are strongly Protestant. So either Lutheran or Calvinist, putting forward ideas of sola fide, sola scriptura, priesthood of all believers, and stuff like that. So this makes the Church of England actually kind of Protestant and not just a cash cow for the King of England. Yes, on it.
Who's managing Edward VIII if both his parents died?
Edward VI. So, yeah, we need to do a lesson on Roman numerals maybe. One of his chief advisors is Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer is a devout Protestant who was actually married to a German Lutheran woman, which of course under Catholicism would not have been allowed because you're not supposed to get married if you're a priest. And so Thomas Cranmer was the archbishop appointed by Henry VIII, and he remained in power after Henry died and kind of nudged Edward towards more and more Protestant-leaning stuff.
Was Edward even making, like, he was 6 years old.
He's a little guy.
And then, like...
Yeah, so very frequently when a child is on the throne, there are actually old men and women behind the scenes pulling the strings.
Wait, how old was he when he died?
I think he was like in his like late teens when he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I think he came to the throne as like a 12 or 13-year-old boy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
that
he
makes sense.
wasn't one when he came. This was just when he ruled.
I thought it was like
Yeah.
he was
So
6 years
So
old.
for a lot of monarchs, they don't list their birth and death dates. They list the dates that they rule.
That makes a lot more sense. I thought you were saying that he was like, it was 6 years.
Right, cool. Well, I'm glad we cleared that up. Yeah, he was like 12 when he came to the throne and like 19 when he died, I think. Around there. Okay, cool. So that's Edward VI. He basically takes the Church of England and makes it actually Protestant, and then he dies. And then Mary comes to the throne, this strict, hyper-religious woman who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, and which means that she's actually kind of related to Philip II of House of Habsburg, and so she does what every good Habsburg does, is marries a relative. And so she marries Philip II and fails to have kids with him. But if she had had a kid with Philip II, that kid would have been in line to inherit both the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of England, and would have been able to unify those two into a single massive state. Possibly. Yes?
Was she unable, or was like one of them unable to have kids?
Well, she was already kind of older when she married, and they were not married for very long. And Philip was often too busy waging religious wars and praying to see to his other kingly duties. Yes, Evan?
Wait, wasn't Philip II also in control of Austria, or was
No. So Charles V, who was Granddaddy Habsburg, split the Habsburg monarchy and gave his brother Germany to deal with. And he gave his beloved son Philip just the best lands. So the Low Countries, Spain, and the Americas.
Okay.
Right, so anyway, Mary decides that she is just going to flip a switch and turn England back into a Catholic territory, and she immediately brings in an inquisition and starts killing Protestants. Protestants continue worshiping in secret, and actually her killing a bunch of Protestants actually makes Protestantism more popular because religious people love martyrs. So you see Protestants being dragged to the stake where they're about to be burned alive, singing and weeping and crying out to Jesus, and everybody's like, dang, they must be right. I mean, you wouldn't burn to death for something that was made up, right? Right. So anyway, English history would have been wildly different if Mary had had a kid and lived, but instead she dies randomly of a disease, and her sister, Elizabeth I, takes over. Elizabeth I is significantly younger than her half-sister, and she is, by all accounts, beautiful, energetic, and brilliant. And she then goes on to rule for about 50 years in what is seen as kind of a cultural golden age. People refer to the time of her rule as the Elizabethan period, in which you see, among other things, the flowering of English theatre and the rise of Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe and other great dramatists of the English language. She also oversees the first voyages of exploration, including the failed attempt at colonization on the island of Roanoke in northeast North Carolina. And she wins a war against Spain. So after Mary dies, Philip II's like, hey, you want to keep a good thing going? And Elizabeth rejects Philip II, partially because she is a Protestant. So after she takes the throne and dumps Philip, or rejects Philip, she begins converting England back to Protestantism. So there's this seesaw, right? It's like, okay, we're Protestant, we're like really Protestant, we're totally Catholic, and we're back to being mostly Protestant again. So, under Elizabeth, you get all sorts of stuff done, but what you really need to know for her is that she establishes a much more moderate position. And she reestablishes the English monarchy directly in the middle of the spectrum. She eliminates some of the more controversial Protestant elements of the Book of Common Prayer and tries to adopt a position that will satisfy both the Catholics and the Puritans. But of course, really what she does is she satisfies neither of the extremes. Fortunately, though, there's a bunch of people in the middle who are chill with her and really just want to stop arguing about religion and get down to the business of like colonizing and making money and going to watch bear baiting shows in the Globe Theater. Yes?
Did England's like economic reforms come through this time also?
The economic reforms and where they copy the Dutch happen in the 1600s. But during this time, England is beginning to emerge, especially the city of London, as a major trading center. Partially this happens after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, where England really begins to emerge as a naval power. They also launch a widespread campaign of piracy against the Spanish, led by Sir Francis Drake, which results in a huge boost to the English economy because they're just stealing literal boatloads of Spanish silver. Okay, next slide, please. So, after Elizabeth dies, things get really interesting because Elizabeth also doesn't have an heir. The Tudors are just really not that good at producing heirs. Edward VI died without an heir, Mary I died without an heir, and Elizabeth I dies without an heir. And the Tudor branch of the English monarchy is kaput. Elizabeth I never married, and she was known as the Virgin Queen, which she definitely was not. She had favorites, including Sir Walter Raleigh, who was probably her lover for several years. Yeah, I like that we're named after the Queen's boy toy. Yeah, but she never had children, and when she dies, the crown goes to her cousin, James Stuart, King of Scotland. He is known as James VI in Scotland, and he receives word that he is now also King of England. So let's talk a little bit about James. So, he's James IV, not James VI. My bad. So James I is not used to cooperating with a parliament. In Scotland, he has more free hand to do as he pleases, and he's looking at other monarchs, especially the French monarchy, which is emerging at this time as a more and more absolute divine right style of monarchy. And so when James I rides down with his Scottish procession to London and gives his speech to Parliament, his very first speech is titled The Divine Right of Kings, in which he announces that nobody has authority to limit the power of the monarchy, and that the monarch does not answer to his subjects, but to God alone. And of course, Parliament hates this. This is essentially the exact opposite of the entire governing principle of England. And so James then goes on to more or less alienate himself from Parliament over the course of his whole reign. Rather than compromising with Parliament, what he does is he just tells Parliament what to do, and Parliament says no. So James disbands Parliament and attempts to rule without parliamentary support, which means he legally cannot raise taxes. So what does he do? He avoids wars, so he doesn't need a lot of money. And then he uses every single legal loophole in the book to get money without having to ask Parliament for it. There are a couple particular ways that the king is allowed to raise some revenue, and one is called ship money. Ship money was a special emergency time tax that the king was allowed to levy on coastal cities for naval defense. So James I, rather than compromising with Parliament, instead begins using this emergency time tax as the only major tax in England to raise all government revenues. And he only taxes major coastal cities.
Makes sense.
This is completely unfair. This is not what the law is supposed to be for. It is supposed to be a minor and temporary tax, and instead, it is now the coastal cities of England are being asked to fund the entire budget of the state, which is total BS, and everybody knows it. But James is able to avoid any big problems because he doesn't get sucked into a big war. Also, besides this, James is also pretty close to the Catholic end of the Anglican spectrum. He had to declare himself an Anglican to become the King of England, which is fine for him. London is worth not a mass. I don't know if he was Catholic beforehand. I was actually wondering about that. But he declares himself an Anglican, but he is as close to a Catholic as you can be without being Anglican. So he basically just pisses off the Puritans, who are increasingly powerful as wealthy merchants within London. And Parliament is being, the House of Commons is being taken over more and more by wealthy, puritanical merchants and landowners. Yes?
I think you can buy your way into nobility, and then Parliament's only made up of nobles.
You're thinking about France. In France, you could purchase a title of nobility. In England, you could not purchase a title of nobility. If you were a noble, you were in the House of Lords, and if you were a commoner, you would be in the you would be represented by the House of Commons. And the only people who voted for the House of Commons were wealthy commoners. So these would be wealthy merchants or wealthy gentry landowners.
Oh, so if you're a peasant, you couldn't be in the land of Congress?
Peasants do not get a vote, and peasants never get any votes because rich people only vote for other rich people. Okay, so James comes in, pisses off Parliament, and then dies. He rules for a while. His boy, Charles I, takes over as king. Charles I is basically a Catholic at heart. He never declares himself Catholic, but there are suspicions that he is a Catholic. Also, Charles doesn't seem to be very good at politics. He's horrible at public relations. He still does nothing to satisfy Parliament. And on top of everything else, he marries a French Catholic woman. And everybody is concerned that his kids are going to be raised deeply Catholic by their Catholic mom. So the King of England is continually edging closer and closer to just full Catholicism again. And people start talking about persecutions and Bloody Mary and all of that stuff. So anyway, Charles once again shuts down Parliament. He tries to call for a tax, and Parliament says they will not cooperate unless Charles I signs a Bill of Rights that will limit the power of the monarchy and ensure the power of Parliament. And in response to this, Charles says, no, you guys aren't listening. I am a divine right monarch. And he shuts down Parliament, and for the next 11 years governs England without parliamentary support. And this is known as the personal rule. And once again, he continues using all of these kind of shady legal dodges to keep raising money for England. What this means is that England has zero money to fight any kind of war, and it's one reason that England remains more or less uninvolved in the 30 Years' War. Like, literally, Charles could not have helped the Protestants if he had wanted to. He simply wouldn't have had the cash. Plus, he probably doesn't want to help the Protestants because he has a secret love for the papacy. So anyway, all of this is fine. All of this is fine. Until he has the nerve to begin reforming the Scottish Church. He introduces the Book of Common Prayer into the strictly Catholic Scottish Highlands. And so this is interesting. So a pretty Catholic dude is introducing a pretty Protestant book into a very Catholic region. And the Catholics flip over the table. The hyper-Catholic Scotch Highlanders go into full-scale rebellion. They put on their kilts, get out their bagpipes and their broadswords, and they go into rebellion. And so all Charles had to do to avoid calling Parliament is not get into a war, and he more or less causes a war for no reason. He provokes it. And so he is forced finally to call Parliament again. And when he calls Parliament, Parliament is going to remain in session for years, and it is going to be known as the Long Parliament. And what is going to happen is Parliament is going to go to war against Charles I rather than disband. So Charles I calls them up and says, this is an emergency, the Scots are rebelling, we need an army right now. And Parliament says, we don't care about Scotland. Scotland is your kingdom, not ours. If you want us to vote money so you can go retake your other kingdom, you're going to have to sign the Petition of Rights. And Charles says, absolutely no way. And he begins calling in soldiers, and people worry that he is about to essentially stage a coup and have members of Parliament arrested. So rather than stick around and let Charles essentially arrest Parliament, the parliamentary leaders disband to their local estates and begin raising militias to challenge the king. At this point, the king calls up his loyal, noble lords, and both sides begin raising an army, and a civil war begins. So rather than fighting a war against the Scots, who are still rebelling, Charles I is now going to have to fight a war against Parliament. Yeah, so Charles I doesn't play his hand very well. So the English Civil War is a very interesting and complex conflict that we don't have time to go into the details. But the two sides are both pretty interesting and easy to stereotype. The soldiers who fight for the king are known as the Cavaliers. They are mostly from old noble families. They are conservative. Many of them are openly Catholic, or at least high church Anglicans. And their military style is old school. They are made up primarily of excellent cavalry, people who have been riding on horseback and practicing with sword and pistol since the days of their youth, and who long for glory on the battlefield. And so these guys are very good at fighting, but not particularly disciplined. They're not used to listening to orders. So that's the Cavaliers. Does anybody know the King Charles Cavalier Spaniel with his long,
They're
flowing,
so
floppy
cute.
ears?
Yeah.
That's who you should imagine.
They're so cute.
Are we almost done? Is class over?
Class is over, yeah.
Alas, well, I'll tell you about the Roundheads and Old Ironsides on Monday.